Episode 12, Letters of Wishes. Hello, my name is Alexander von der Fellen, and welcome to Trusts Unpacked, where we strip away myth and marketing and explain in plain terms how trusts actually work in real family situations. For the last 20 years, my fiduciary work has focused almost entirely on the architecture of trusts, the skill of trusteeship, and the challenge of long-term family governance. Not as a technical exercise, but as a human one. In doing so, I've advised hundreds of families, as well as institutions and advisors across the world. Alongside my advisory work, I'm a published author. I've recently completed a trilogy that reflects both the technical and the human dimensions of both the fiduciary and private banking fields. Before we begin, a brief but important note. This podcast is provided for general information and discussion only. It does not constitute legal, tax, fiduciary, or professional advice, and it should not be relied upon as such. As ever, you should always seek advice from appropriately qualified professionals in your relevant jurisdiction before making decisions or taking action. By now, reaching episode 12 of our 20, one theme should be unmistakable. That theme is that trusts do not work because of clever drafting alone. They work because of judgment, behavior, and restraint. Today's subject sits squarely in that space, letters of wishes. They are widely used, often misunderstood, and frequently mishandled. When done well, a letter of wishes provides guidance across time. When done badly, it creates confusion, pressure, and risk. This session is about using this soft power properly. So what actually is a letter of wishes? Well, a letter of wishes is not part of the trust deed. That point alone resolves many misunderstandings. It is not legally binding. It does not create rights, and it does not impose obligations. That's not a weakness. It's just the whole point. A letter of wishes allows a settlor to explain intent without freezing that intent into law. It exists in the space between silence and instruction. The trust deed sets the architecture. The letter of wishes explains the thinking that led to it. This distinction matters enormously. Trust deeds must be precise, durable, and abstract. Letters of wishes can be personal, reflective, and contextual. They speak to trustees not as legal operators, but as human decision makers. And because they are non-binding, their effectiveness depends entirely on how they are written and how they are used. The law gives trustees discretion. The letter of wishes helps trustees understand how that discretion was meant to be exercised, not mechanically, but thoughtfully. Letters of wishes matter far more than people expect. Trust deeds are necessarily incomplete, not defective, just incomplete. They define powers, classes, and mechanisms. They do not explain motivation. They do not explain why certain beneficiaries were included, or why discretion was chosen over entitlement, or why flexibility was prioritized over certainty. A letter of wishes fills that gap. It answers the unspoken question that trustees always ask, such as, what was the settlor actually trying to achieve? This becomes increasingly important over time. Trustees change, assets evolve, family circumstances shift. The settlor may no longer be alive or involved, and at that point, the letter of wishes often becomes the only surviving articulation of intent. A good letter of wishes becomes a voice across time, not a command, but a guide. It helps trustees distinguish core principles from temporary concerns, values from tactics, and intent from emotion. Without this guidance, trustees are left to infer intent from structure alone, and that is rarely enough. Letters of wishes also have a psychological role. In fact, they operate as much psychologically as they do legally, and this fact is often overlooked. They reassure trustees that discretion was intentional. They reassure beneficiaries that there was thought behind the structure. They reassure future trustees that they are not acting blindly, but they can also do the opposite. Poorly written letters create anxiety. Trustees worry about disappointing a dead settlor. Beneficiaries treat letters as promises. Advisors treat them as quasi-instructions. The letter becomes a source of pressure rather than guidance, and understanding this psychological impact is essential. There is also an important asymmetry to recognize. Settlors often write letters of wishes at moments of clarity. Trustees read them at moments of uncertainty, and this temporal mismatch matters. A settlor may write confidently about priorities, believing them to be obvious. Years later, trustees face circumstances the settlor may have never imagined: market dislocation, family breakdown, or illness, regulatory change. And at those moments, a letter that insists on certainty can feel oppressive. By contrast, a letter that acknowledges uncertainty can feel supportive. So the best letters do not try to eliminate doubt, they just legitimize it. They say implicitly, I knew you would be facing difficult choices, and I trusted you to face them. That matters enormously when trustees are under strain. So what do good letters of wishes contain? Well, they share 5 key characteristics that are remarkably consistent across jurisdictions and families. First of all, they explain purpose, not outcomes. A good letter explains why the trust exists, what problem it was designed to resolve, what risks it was meant to manage, what values it reflects. It doesn't attempt to predict every scenario. Trustees need purpose, after all, not prophecy. Secondly, they articulate priorities. Where trade-offs arise, what matters more? Education versus early independence, support versus incentive, equality versus responsiveness. These priorities guide judgment when circumstances collide. Thirdly, they acknowledge uncertainty. Good letters accept that the future cannot be known. They explicitly invite trustees to adapt. This is a sign of confidence, not weakness. Fourthly, they are written in plain language. The best letters sound like the settlor. They avoid legal drafting. They avoid technical jargon. They read as human documents. This matters. Trustees engage far more deeply with documents that feel genuine. Number 5, they leave space for discretion. After all, good letters do not try to control, they guide. They contextualize, they suggest, they don't instruct. Settlors who attempt to anticipate every eventuality often reveal anxiety rather than foresight, and that anxiety transmits itself to trustees. By contrast, letters that focus on a small number of core principles often remain relevant for decades. They give trustees something stable to hold on to when circumstances become fluid. What should letters of wishes avoid? Because many letters of wishes cause harm rather than help, not because of malice, but because of misunderstanding. 4 particularly damaging patterns deserve explicit mention, and they're all about letters that attempt to correct family behavior. You see, some settlors use letters of wishes to express disappointment, frustration, or moral instruction. They write about perceived lack of effort or entitlement or behavior they wish to discourage. Now, while this is understandable, it's rarely effective. Trustees just aren't well placed to enforce moral judgments. Beneficiaries often read such letters defensively or even resentfully. The letter becomes a source of grievance rather than guidance. Worse, trustees may feel pressure to implement behavioral correction through distributions. This is almost always counterproductive. If behavioral incentives are desired, they must be built structurally into the trust, not delegated emotionally through a letter. Letters are guides, not tools of discipline. So, what are the 4 negative characteristics of a bad letter of wishes? Number 1, over-prescription. Detailed instructions about distributions, percentages, or timing often feel binding in practice, even when they are not. Trustees hesitate, discretion narrows, pressure increases. The letter becomes a shadow trustee. Secondly, we've got contradiction. Letters that conflict with the trustee or with earlier letters create uncertainty. Trustees are left to guess which version actually reflects true intent. This undermines confidence. Number 3, emotional offloading. Letters written in anger, disappointment, or fear age badly. They burden trustees with unresolved emotion. It's not guidance, it's displacement. After all, trustees are not therapists. Number 4, constant revision. Frequent updates of letters of wishes often signal either instability or an inability to let go, or both. Trustees value clarity, not perpetual adjustment. So now let's look at timing and longevity. The thing is, one of the most overlooked questions is when a letter of wishes should be written. The best time is often after the trust is established, not during the heat of planning. Distance improves clarity. Equally important is recognizing the letters of wishes age. Some age well, some age badly. Letters that focus on principles tend to remain relevant. Letters that focus on circumstances, less so. This is why restraint matters. A letter that is never updated may become irrelevant. A letter that is updated constantly may lose authority. The balance lies in deliberate review. Letters of wishes also interact with time in a more subtle way. A letter written by a founder often carries authority while that founder is alive. After death, the same letter can feel heavier. Trustees may worry about betraying legacy. Beneficiaries may mythologize intent. This is why settlors should be careful not to over-invest letters with finality. Language that suggests permanence or moral weight can freeze discretion long after it should have adapted. Some of the most effective letters explicitly acknowledge their own provisional nature. They invite trustees to reinterpret intent in light of future reality. It's not weakness, it's actually confidence that values, not instructions, should endure. Now let's look at how a trustee should read a letter of wishes. For trustees, a letter of wishes must be weighed alongside current circumstances and independent judgment. Experienced trustees tend to read letters of wishes in layers. First, they absorb tone. Then they identify principles, and only then do they consider specifics. Inexperienced trustees often reverse this order. They fixate on detail, they search for instruction, they worry about compliance. And this difference explains why the same letter can be liberating in one set of hands and paralyzing in another. It also explains why trustee selection matters so much when letters are detailed. A strong trustee can absorb specificity without surrendering judgment. A weak trustee is less able to. Letters of wishes should therefore be drafted with the likely trustee audience in mind. Trustees should ask if it is still aligned with the trust purpose, whether it reflects principle or context, and whether this is designed to inform rather than dictate their decision. Trustees should not treat letters as instructions, ignore them for convenience, or defer to them mechanically. Balance is the skill. Now let's deal with letters of wishes and beneficiary expectations. Letters of wishes often leak, not formally, but informally. Beneficiaries hear about them. Fragments may be discussed, assumptions form, and this is often where trouble begins. Beneficiaries may interpret letters as promises or as evidence of entitlement, and trustees should be very careful here. Letters of wishes are written for trustees, not beneficiaries. Where disclosure is appropriate, it should be contextual and managed. Unmanaged disclosure creates expectation without understanding. It's also important to recognize that letters of wishes often become symbolic. Beneficiaries may never read them in full, but they do talk about them. They want me to be supported, they might say. They never intended this outcome. They said education mattered most. And these fragments circulate. Trustees must be alert to this phenomenon. When beneficiaries invoke letters selectively, trustees should return the conversation to structure. What does the trust allow? What discretion exists? What process governs decisions? Engaging in an interpretative debate about letters with beneficiaries almost always escalates tension. Letters speak to trustees, not to beneficiaries. That confidential boundary must be maintained. Let me show you what confidentiality looks like when it's not a preference but a necessity. I will again use a case study from my book, Trust. In 2017, I was contacted by an intermediary in Amsterdam on behalf of a Jewish family scattered across 4 continents. 4 generations, 26 people, some of whom have not spoken with each other for decades. They were being brought together by a single event, the restitution of a painting stolen in Vienna in 1938. For most of the family's history, the painting had been a memory rather than an asset. It had hung above a piano before the war, disappeared after the Anschluss, and survived only in a grainy black and white photograph taken hurriedly before confiscation. Its return nearly 80 years later was both miraculous, but also dangerous. Once restitution was confirmed, the risk multiplied quickly. The painting was valuable, very valuable. More importantly, it carried history, grief, and symbolism that money could simply not soften. Some family members wanted it sold. Others wanted it kept. One wanted only a copy to show a child. Another demanded clarity on legal ownership before any discussion could continue. Publicity would have been catastrophic. A press release would have turned private trauma into spectacle. It would have exposed elderly survivors to unwanted attention, invited dealers and litigators into family conversations, and hardened positions before trust had time to form. Physical security was also a concern. So was negotiating strength if the family chose to borrow against the asset. We agreed on one principle from the outset: silence. No media, no announcements, no leaks, not even within extended social circles. Confidentiality created a protected space in which the family could speak honestly, maybe for the first time. Arguments happened, tears were shed, memories surfaced, but they happened privately, without performance. We structured a discretionary trust to own the painting. High-quality canvas copies were made for those who wanted a visual connection. The original was insured, stored securely, and governed carefully. Later, an art-backed loan unlocked part of its value, generating income to support both family members and Holocaust survivor programs. What mattered most was therefore not the structure, but the atmosphere. Confidentiality allowed disagreement without fracture. It prevented external narratives from defining meaning. It gave the family back something they had lost long before the painting itself, and that was control. This is why confidentiality matters in trusteeship. Letters of wishes depend on this same discipline. They only work when settlors trust that what they say will be held, not broadcast. When trustees understand that silence is sometimes the most responsible act. In this case, the painting returned, but so did something rarer: trust, almost without being noticed and without an audience. And this is what confidentiality makes possible. Letters of wishes are also a form of risk management. In fact, the well-written letter of wishes is one of the most effective risk management tools available. It supports trustee independence, reduces interpretive conflict, and provides continuity across trustee changes. Courts don't treat letters as binding, but they do treat them as evidence of intent. A thoughtful letter often diffuses disputes before they escalate. Silence leaves space for assumption. Clarity reduces it. And writing a good letter of wishes requires discipline. The discipline to articulate values rather than outcomes, accept uncertainty, and trust future decision makers. It's not easy. For many settlors, a letter of wishes is the final moment of influence. Using that moment wisely matters. A letter written with humility strengthens the trust. A letter written with control undermines it. There's now an issue that I must address directly. Letters of wishes sit uncomfortably close to the boundary between influence and control. If handled poorly, they can create legal risk. In extreme cases, they can even undermine the integrity of the trust itself. The central danger arises when a letter of wishes ceases to be guidance and becomes, in practice, instruction. Trustees who mistakenly treat a letter as binding, even subconsciously, risk surrendering independent judgment. If discretion is not genuinely exercised, but merely implemented in accordance with settled direction, the structure begins to weaken. It's not theoretical. Courts look at behavior, not labels. If trustees consistently follow detailed instructions without deviation, without recorded reasoning, without fresh consideration, the distinction between deed and letter blurs. That blurring can lead to serious consequences, particularly in jurisdictions where questions of sham, reserved powers, or effective control are scrutinized. This doesn't mean letters of wishes are dangerous. It means they simply require discipline on both sides. Settlors must resist the temptation to script outcomes. Trustees must resist the temptation to defer to comfort. The test is simple. Can trustees explain a decision without saying, because the letter told us to? If they can't, independence has eroded. A letter of wishes should influence thinking. It should never replace it. So what happens when circumstances change? Trustees must treat letters of wishes as living context rather than static instruction. A common difficulty, therefore, arises when a letter reflects a settlor's view of beneficiaries at a particular stage in life. A child described as responsible at age 12 may struggle at 25. A beneficiary once considered unreliable may become disciplined and successful. If trustees treat a letter as frozen character assessment, they risk injustice. Letters describe perception. Trustees, however, operate in reality. The skill lies in distinguishing between enduring values and outdated judgments. Some letters do this well. They describe hopes rather than labels. They express aspirations rather than verdicts. Others do not. They record disappointment. They catalogue frustration. They assign identity, and those letters age badly. Trustees must have the confidence to recognize when a letter's context has expired. Respect doesn't require rigidity. Fidelity to purpose may, however, require adaptation. It's also not uncommon for settlors to write more than one letter of wishes. Sometimes those letters are carefully sequenced. More often, they reflect evolving emotion. A letter written during a family harmony reads far more differently from one written during dispute. A letter written during financial optimism carries a different tone from one written during market contraction. Trustees faced with multiple letters must resist the instinct to search for the most convenient version. Instead, they must identify continuity. What themes persist across all the letters? What principles remain constant? Where do the letters diverge? And why? Chronology matters, but so does coherence. If successive letters reflect growing anxiety or increasing prescriptiveness, trustees should be cautious about allowing late-stage fear to dominate earlier principles. Equally, trustees should not ignore recent clarification simply because it complicates administration. The task is interpretive, and that interpretation should be recorded. When trustees consciously reconcile conflicting letters and document their reasoning, they protect themselves and the trust. Now, I've seen letters of wishes used quite often in philanthropic structures. They're particularly powerful in these kind of trusts. Here, purpose often matters far more than family dynamic. Settlors may articulate values that are deeply personal: education access, medical research, cultural preservation, community uplift. In such cases, the letter becomes a moral compass. But even here, restraint matters. A philanthropic letter that lists specific institutions without explaining underlying principle can create unwelcome rigidity. Institutions change, reputations evolve, impact fluctuates. Trustees need criteria, not lists. The most enduring philanthropic letters, however, describe what success looks like. They describe desired impact. They describe acceptable risk. They describe geographic focus or thematic interests. They do not freeze generosity into fixed recipients. This allows trustees to honor intent whilst adapting to reality. It also protects against reputational risk. Blind loyalty to named institutions may undermine broader purpose. A letter that articulates values rather than beneficiaries empowers trustees to respond intelligently. There's another use of letters of wishes that deserves a lot of attention. They can be amazing tools of education, not legal education, cultural education. A well-written letter can help younger beneficiaries understand why the trust exists, why discretion was chosen, why wealth is structured rather than distributed outright. When trustees choose to share portions of a letter appropriately and thoughtfully, it can frame the trust as intentional rather than restrictive. This must be handled carefully. Not all letters are suitable for disclosure, but where tone is constructive and values are articulated clearly, selective sharing can reduce resentment. It can transform the trust from a mysterious gatekeeper into a considered design. Education through letters requires coordination between settlor and trustee. It should never be assumed. But where done well, it strengthens long-term governance. As I said, writing a letter of wishes is often the last act of control that a settlor exercises. This also makes it emotionally charged. There is an instinct to resolve unfinished conversations, to correct perceived injustice, to signal preference, to protect. But a letter of wishes is not a call. It's not a therapy session. It's not a final speech. The emotional discipline required is considerable. Settlors must ask themselves, am I writing to guide or to correct? Am I expressing values or venting frustration? Am I trusting future trustees or trying to control? The difference is there, visible on the page. Trustees can feel it. Beneficiaries eventually sense it. Letters of wishes are instruments of governance, not closure. Now, what about the trustee's responsibility to revisit a letter of wishes? They're often read once, filed, revisited only when disputes arise, and that is insufficient. Trustees should return to letters periodically, not to relitigate intent, but to re-anchor understanding, particularly when trustee boards change. New trustees should be briefed not only on the trust deed, but on the philosophy expressed in the letter. This creates continuity of judgment. Without this discipline, letters become archival artifacts rather than living guidance. Trustees should also ensure that letters are stored securely and access is controlled. Confidentiality must be deliberate. Leakage undermines trust. Proper stewardship of the letter is itself part of trusteeship. One of the most sensitive moments in the life of a trust occurs when a founder moves from active involvement to absence. This transition may be gradual through age or illness, or abrupt through death. During the founder's lifetime, a letter of wishes often feels like background guidance. Trustees can clarify ambiguities directly. Beneficiaries may treat the document as sacred text. Advisors may elevate it to quasi-instructional status. This shift is psychological rather than legal, but it is powerful. Trustees must consciously resist allowing reverence to become rigidity. The founder's intent deserves respect, of course, but it does not require paralysis. The key question is not, what would the founder have done? That question is unanswerable. The better question is, how would the founder have wanted discretion to operate in this circumstance? Now, that distinction preserves both principle and flexibility. In practice, the most effective founder letters are those that explicitly prepare trustees for their own absence. They say, in substance, you will know more than I do about the future. Use your judgment. That sentence, even implied rather than written, releases trustees from fear of betrayal. It transforms a letter from a monument into a mandate. Nevertheless, letters of wishes are sometimes written during periods of great family tension. This is understandable. Conflict clarifies perception, but it also distorts it. A settlor who writes a letter during active dispute may unintentionally embed temporary emotion into long-term governance. Preferences may harden, language may sharpen, priorities may narrow. Trustees who encounter such letters must be alert to context. Was this letter written during stability or stress? Does it reflect enduring value or situational reaction? The difference is rarely explicit. It must be inferred. This is where trustee maturity and experience matters. A literal reading may inflame conflict. A contextual reading may preserve balance. For example, a letter written during sibling disagreement may emphasize equal treatment strongly. Years later, circumstances may justify unequal support. If trustees cling to the reactive emphasis, they risk injustice. If they ignore it entirely, they risk appearing dismissive. The appropriate course is obviously deliberate engagement. Record that the emphasis was noted, explain why present circumstances differ, and demonstrate that discretion is being exercised with awareness, not convenience. Conflict letters should not be dismissed, but nor should they govern uncritically. Now let's look at letters of wishes and cultural context. Because trusts increasingly operate across jurisdictions and cultures, letters of wishes must reflect this reality. Cultural expectations about wealth, obligation, and hierarchy vary enormously, and a letter written in one cultural context may be interpreted very differently in another. In some cultures, strong patriarchal instruction is expected and welcome. In others, collaborative tone is valued. In some environments, naming beneficiaries explicitly signals fairness. In others, silence is assumed to imply trust. Trustees operating internationally must therefore read letters with cultural sensitivity. Literal translation may not capture intent. Tone may not survive jurisdictional nuance. Where letters are written in one language and trustees operate in another, careful interpretation is required. Subtle shifts in wording can alter perceived authority 180 degrees. The example is the difference between I would prefer and I expect may be significant. Translations should preserve tone, not just content. Cultural context also affects beneficiary expectation. In certain environments, a letter of wishes may be treated socially as binding, even if legally non-binding. Trustees must be aware of the standard. Clarity about legal status should be maintained gently but firmly. The cultural power of a letter must not override fiduciary responsibility. Let's look at digital letters and informal communication. Because modern communication introduces new complexity. Emails, recorded messages, draft notes stored digitally. What constitutes a letter of wishes? Is it an email expressing preference? Is that equivalent to a formal letter? What about a video message or notes on a document? Trustees must exercise caution here. Not every informal communication should be elevated to the status of a letter of wishes. Formality matters. Intent to guide matters. A letter of wishes is typically a considered document, delivered consciously. Off-the-cuff communication may express mood rather than principle. Trustees should differentiate between formal letters and incidental correspondence. This distinction should be documented. Otherwise, governments risks being distorted by fragments. Digital permanence also creates risk. Drafts may circulate unintentionally. Earlier versions may conflict with final documents. Trustees should ensure that the only operative version of a letter is retained in official records. Clarity prevents interpretive confusion later. There's now a practical dimension when it comes to trustees that is worth stating plainly. And that is that letters of wishes can protect trustees. When a decision aligns with articulated intent, trustees can demonstrate that discretion was exercised with awareness of founding philosophy. This doesn't make the decision unchallengeable, but it certainly strengthens defensibility. Conversely, absence of a letter may leave trustees exposed to integrity dispute. Beneficiaries may claim that the structure was intended differently. Advisors may speculate about purpose. A thoughtful letter reduces that ambiguity. However, trustees must avoid over-reliance. Protection arises from engagement with the letter, not mechanical compliance. Courts will ask, did the trustees consider the letter? Did they weigh it appropriately? Did they exercise independent judgment? A letter ignored entirely may suggest negligence. A letter followed blindly may suggest abdication. The protection, as ever, lies in balance. There is a paradox at the heart of the letter of wishes. The more forcefully they attempt to control, the less effective they become. The more they trust discretion, the more influence they tend to exert. Trustees respond to tone. A letter that conveys confidence in trustee judgment encourages careful, principled decision-making. A letter that conveys suspicion or anxiety may provoke defensive administration. Influence is strongest when it feels invited rather than imposed. This is why brevity often strengthens authority. A concise letter focused on core values often carries far more weight than a lengthy one cataloguing scenarios. Trustees remember principles. They struggle to remember exhaustive detail. The paradox is simple. Restraint magnifies influence, control diminishes it. All of these considerations reinforce one single insight, that letters of wishes are instruments of continuity. They connect founding intent to future judgment. They carry values forward without freezing them. They influence without binding. They guide without dictating. Their effectiveness depends less on legal structure than on emotional discipline. When written with clarity and humility, they strengthen governance calmly and enduringly. When written with anxiety or control, they create tension that reverberates long after the settlor's voice has faded. So, as we close this 12th episode and our dive into letters of wishes, let's make the lessons explicit. What have we learned? First, that a letter of wishes explains thinking, not law. Second, that the deed sets architecture, the letter provides context. Confusing the two weakens both. Third, that tone matters as much as content. A calm, trusting letter encourages independent judgment. An anxious or prescriptive letter narrows discretion psychologically, even if not legally. Fourth, the good letters focus on purpose and priorities, not outcomes and percentages. Trustees need principles to navigate uncertainty, not scripts to follow mechanically. Fifth, that restraint strengthens influence. The more a letter attempts to control, the less effective it becomes. Sixth, that letters must age well. Those rooted in enduring values remain relevant. Those rooted in temporary emotional conflict often become liabilities. Seventh, the trustees must treat letters as relevant considerations, not instructions. Ignoring them is negligence. Following them blindly is abdication. Eighth, that confidentiality matters. Letters are written for trustees, not beneficiaries. Unmanaged disclosure creates expectation without understanding. Ninth, that successive letters require interpretation. Trustees must look for continuity of principle rather than convenience of instruction. 10th, that writing a letter of wishes requires emotional discipline from the settlor. It's not a vehicle for correction, frustration, or final control. 11th, that a well-written letter reduces risk. It clarifies intent, supports trustee confidence, and strengthens defensibility when decisions are challenged. And finally, that a letter of wishes is a bridge between the founder and the future, between values and discretion, between personality and institution. In short, the best letters guide without gripping, influence without constraining, and trust without surrendering structure. When they achieve that balance, they become one of the underlying strengths of a well-governed trust. And that was Letters of Wishes, Unpacked. Join me in the next episode of the series, our 13th and penultimate of this group of episodes dealing with decision-making, governance, and administration, as we continue to look at decision-making, governance, and administration in trusts by unpacking trust administration in practice, focusing on reporting, accounts, and governance. Until then, I am Alexander von der Fellen.